Ben Habib leaves Reform and Andrea Jenkins comes in. Now, Andrea Jenkins stood as a Tory in the last parliamentary election and she lost her seat. Ben Habib, of course, stood for Reform and he failed to get a seat as well. But Ben Habib is right about Brexit and the UK's failure to leave the European Union properly. If we go back to the 1970s, there's a document called FCO, which is the Foreign and Commonwealth Office. That's FCO 30/1048. Never mentioned by UKIP, never mentioned by Farage, never mentioned by the Brexit Party or Reform. This document is 270 pages. It's commented on by people like Peter Shaw, who was an MP for the Labour Party at the time. And the question is, under the English Constitution, the Magna Carta, the Bill of Rights, Declaration of Rights, and everything that makes up the English Constitution, is our relationship with the European Economic Community as it was then, was it legal? And the answer it came back with was no, because you cannot hand over power to a foreign power. So the way the English Constitution works is that England and Wales is just like a little sidecar as far as England is concerned. There's no act of union between England and Wales, and they have the same constitution and they have the same law, which is common law. Scotland has a different law. It uses Roman law and essentially has its own constitution. But there is an act of union making up Great Britain and Northern Ireland making up the United Kingdom, and that legal fiction, as it were, can create contracts or treaties with foreign entities, which it did with the European Economic Community, has done with the United Nations, has done with the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel for Climate Change, has done with the World Health Organization, so on. But a lot of these relationships under the English Constitution are effectively unlawful, and Ben Habib is absolutely right about this. Therefore, in the 1970s, it was necessary to do two things. The first thing was to trick Parliament itself. This is important to understand because not all MPs understand what is going on at any moment in time, and therefore a lot of them will be whipped to vote in a certain way to get certain acts of Parliament through. And of course, the second trick was to trick the electorate in 1975 with the first referendum, and that referendum was unusually counted, let's say, where all the ballot boxes were taken down to Earl's Court and only the CIA had access to those boxes for 3 or 4 days. The reason the CIA came into this was because the Eurpean movement in the 1970s, there was no appetite for Britain to join the European Economic Community because it had free trade with 66 nations. Those 66 nations were what was known as the Commonwealth nations. So the CIA came up with the funding for the European movement and effectively shoehorned us into the European Economic Community. If you're interested in more information on this, this is all government record, and it can be found in David Barmby's The EU, A Corporate Racket, a book that was written a few years ago. So by joining the EEC, the UK effectively lost sovereignty. It lost aspects of its constitution because now it has given away power to a foreign entity. It lost fishing rights. Well, the UK or Britain is a small island surrounded by water, so fishing is potentially very important to it. It lost agricultural rights. When the UK went into the European Economic Community, food prices in the 1970s were some of the lowest in Europe. Now look at them. It lost the Black Arrow space program. That was a program with a small budget of about £8 or £9 million, which was being run from Australia, but by the British. And it lost free trade with 66 nations and gained free trade with about 6 or 7 nations in Europe. So it was a net huge loser, and prices immediately went up. So we fast forward then to 2016, and there were 4 elections. The first was the election on Brexit itself. There were local elections where Theresa May, because she was failing to get Brexit done, she lost 1,000 seats for the Tories. There were the European elections. The Brexit Party romped home with that. And then there was the general election, Boris Johnson, let's get Brexit done. So there were 2 ways of leaving the European Union. One was under the English Constitution, just repeal the European Communities Act, and there we are, we're out. The second way was to implement Article 50 under the EU's own treaty. That was what was done. We ended up 2 years later with the first of 3 treaties, a withdrawal agreement which didn't quite seem to withdraw from anything. Later on we get PASCO under Liz Truss, which is the Army, Navy, Air Force, all under the control of the European Union, even though we're supposed to have left. And it seems that David Lammy is continuing with that today. And the third was the Windsor Agreement, which essentially gives away Northern Ireland. It gives away an entire country to the European Union. Now, of course, Nigel Farage knows all of this. Reform and UKIP should all have a great understanding of the English constitution, but seem to have chosen to ignore it. Reform pushed the jab, which seemed to be a globalist psyop. Richard Tice chose to dabble with the Ukrainian conflict. Reform worked with Hope Not Hate to oust at least 20 candidates, and Hope Not Hate are a known communist organisation. Reform have never spoken about closing the borders, only removing illegals, and there's much more that can be done as far as immigration is concerned. Reform have never really had a moral base. They've always gone along with the woke cult for as long as it suits them. And they alienated the working class by distancing themselves, not just from Tommy Robinson, but also his supporters. Now, I appreciate that Tommy Robinson has his own funding, he has his own handlers and so on and so forth, but his supporters, many of his supporters might have voted Reform, and Reform distanced themselves from their own voters. So despite now 100,000 members, it seems that Reform are doing a great job of keeping people divided.